Alright, so welcome to my TED Talk. I'll start off by just going through some of the slides in the slideshow. I'll try to go relatively quickly. I'll just showcase a few of the debugging features. There are some beginner ones, some intermediate ones, and kind of some more advanced ones. So I'll try to do quickly through the beginner ones and then a few of the intermediate ones. Whether you're a technical person or non-technical, developer or non-developer, I'll try to explain what is debugging very quickly, just so we kind of all on the same page. Expect a lot of memes as well. What is debugging? Debugging is basically a process of kind of trying to identify the root cause of a specific problem that we're encountering within our code. Sometimes it can feel like a trial and error sort of process, because you just have to sometimes start where you're not even sure of what's happening and just slowly walk your way through the code in the hopes that you will find some sort of clue and eventually get on a path to get to the root cause of the problem. It can be described the best as an iterative process where you kind of keep going down a process, down a path, until you have some sort of clue or a bunch of clues leading you in the right sort of direction. Essentially, it's where we investigate discrepancies between our expected and actual results of the code, whether it's calculations or whether it's expected UI behavior within an application. Try to resolve such issues in the software. I'll give a quick example just now, but yeah, in Visual Studio, debugging is facilitated, with breakpoints, variable inspections, runtime evaluations, and you can do all of that from within Visual Studio. And yeah, it's kind of very similar between other IDEs or other code editors. So a simple example, just to kind of give context to the whole process and the whole thing, is, let's say we have a simple software application or a web app. The front end is a web user interface, and we have a form where the user inputs a bunch of information and then clicks a button like save or next, and on click of that button it kind of triggers a series of actions or calculations. Maybe it does a whole bunch of calculations first and then saves all the information and all the calculations that have been done. And let's say there's something wrong with the user's clicking save, but maybe things are not being saved, or maybe it's being saved but all the calculations are incorrect, something like that. QA or the user comes back to the team and gives a rundown of the problem. The developer then needs to go and figure out where to start or what exactly is the problem. So easiest point is to go to that button click, and under the button click in the code there should be some sort of function which that button click triggers, and then that would be a good place to start, good place to put a breakpoint, and then he or she can kind of see what exactly is happening in the code from there, and just step through each line of code and evaluate each calculation or whatever the case is, see what's happening, see what is going on, hopefully see what the problem is. So some challenges of debugging is that it can be very difficult when you may be new to a code base, you're unfamiliar with it. Some code bases are really complex, really large. It can be difficult navigating, especially if it hasn't been written well or it hasn't been written in such a nice way or easy way of navigating it, things like that. It can be very time consuming, that you end up using a lot of time, few hours, only to find that it's one little line of code which maybe you even missed going through it because it was so complicated, so much code to go through. But unfortunately that is how it goes, that's just the process. But on the upside is that through this sort of debugging process you do seem to learn a lot. It does help you get more familiar with the code base in aspects or in places of the code base that you maybe wouldn't usually go so deep into. So that's a good upside. Alright, so let's start with some simple debugging features. So we've got a couple of basic ones which we'll go through. And yeah, so I've got a simple application which I'm going to use just to kind of demonstrate some of these things. It's just a simple console application. It's just a blackjack service. I guess we don't really need to worry about what exactly the code's doing, but let's just start with the basic one. So when you're debugging, the first thing that you can do is put breakpoints wherever you want the code execution to stop. So let's start here. This process blackjack round is kind of like the entry method to the program. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint there. Let me run the program. So when it runs, we need to input one thing, and straight after that, as it runs, we should expect that the code should stop at our breakpoint. And then we can kind of inspect some variables, see what's happening. So you can see there, it did indeed stop. You can see with the yellow where your cursor is, or where the line in the code is, where the code has stopped. While you're here, you can inspect all the variables. So for example, the ones above here that are the arguments to the method, you can hover over it, you can expand, you can see, because you can see that this is an object, so it's of type dealer, which has a bunch of properties on it. We go to the dealer, you can see that it has a bunch of stuff, you know, like a name, you can get dealer instance, etc. So let's go back, so we can hover over it, we can see that its hand is 0, its name is dealer, and it also has some dealt cards here, which you can also expand and see. So next one is step over or step into. So you can use some shortcut keys of F10 and F11 for stepping over or stepping into things. Stepping into F11, which is also this one here, F10 is step over. So what that means is if I press F10, as I navigate through, so for example, let's say I press F10 now, it'll go to the next line of code. So if I press F11, it'll step into whatever the next call is. So if I press F11, it's going to step into the check dealer method. So if I press F11 now, you can see that it navigates into the check dealer method, and then we can F11 all the way through. Process hands, so if I press F11 again, it'll navigate now into the process hands method. Now if I wanted to skip going through both of these methods, I can just use F10 and it'll kind of step over that entire method. It'll execute it, it just won't navigate through while you're debugging. So it'll execute and then move to this line over here, F10. So like there, I just F10, it didn't go into this method here. So it can be a quicker way just to get through things. While we're here, again, you can also hover over things just to see, but like you can see here in the grayed out text, it kind of shows you what these variables are. Obviously the objects it won't show, but for example like players, it'll show you count since it is a list of 4. So for example, I can hover over dealer, I can see what's in that object. I can also hover over this hand, see that if it's changed or whatever the case is. These are kind of very basic aspects of debugging, which I think most developers should be familiar with and should be using in the day-to-day sort of work, especially when they're debugging. Let's now move on to a couple of slightly more advanced debugging features. We'll leave our breakpoint or our code execution where it is at the moment. Now I'm going to go here to the search and I'm just going to look for the immediate window. I'm going to open that. The immediate window you can use to execute commands or inspect variables at runtime, evaluate expressions, even call certain functions, even modify variables. Basically, it's kind of like a code editor, just in real time as you're debugging. So for example, let's say I typed out players. See, it can give me all that's in the list there. I guess, let's say I wanted to know how many was in the list. I could just say players.count and it'll give me the count of the players. Let's say I wanted to update dealer hand. What I could then do, and let's see what it is now, 19. If I want to update it to be 18, I could do that. I can go over and hover over and you can see it's updated to 18 there as well. You can then continue the execution and it'll continue with the new updated value of that variable. It can be useful just to do testing on certain things on the fly when you need to. It can be quite useful just to execute certain things that you need to test or try while you're debugging and while you're at that specific point in execution of the code. Cool, let's move on. So we're gonna now switch to our quick watch and locals tab. See here I can go to the locals tab. This then gives me a kind of breakdown or a list of the various variables that we have in scope or throughout the execution process that we've been through so far. And we can kind of view all the local variables and their value during our debugging. So like you can see there, we can see the dealer again, which is here, the one we hovered over. You can also expand it there. You can see all its properties. You can also see the players there, same thing. You can expand and see. One nice thing, what I can do then is, let's say I want to keep a track. I want to quickly just go through, debug, and execute over this for each loop. But I just want to see see when a certain player actually gets used, and if it is within here and it does actually go into this method or this line of code. What I can do is I can highlight player, right click, and I can say add watch. So you can see now in our locals tab, you can see the dealer over there. You can see player. It doesn't show yet because we haven't moved past the first stage of the for each. What I'll do is I'll just step through, step into, and now you can see player is going to get populated. As we step into the for each, you can see the player gets populated there, and I can see, okay, it's Billy 1, maybe that's not the one I want, so I'll let it run, go to the next one. I'll see, Lemmy 2, maybe that's the one, so then I'll kind of now follow the code execution through, maybe go into there, see what happens, see why it's calculating or not. Yeah, the watch and the locals tab can be quite useful if you want certain variables as you go along. Obviously there's a lot more that you can do with it. This is just a kind of basic introduction to it. But yeah, let's look at another one. So let's say, okay, this is quite a small piece of code, but let's say I had a long piece of code and I kind of was only interested in getting here. Option 1 is that I could add a breakpoint here, let it run, get it there, and then continue. But maybe I don't want to add a breakpoint, remove the breakpoint, that sort of thing. So what I can then do is I can right click on this line and I can select run to cursor, and if I click that, what it will do is you'll see it'll just continue running, and then it'll break or stop at that point, at that line where you clicked. So it's quite useful. It's quite a much easier way if you debugging some code and you get into quite a long piece of code and you realize you're not worried about all this other stuff first. You just need to start there, and you don't have to add breakpoints and bother removing breakpoints later on. So it's a useful and easy way just to get there, and then you can kind of continue, do what you need to do. So I'll just discuss some of these more advanced debugging features. Maybe I'll just show the conditional breakpoints, which is quite useful. What you can do with a conditional breakpoint, like we did earlier when we used the watch for the player variable, if we want to, let's say, our breakpoint to hit only when the name of the player code is Lemmy, right? So what we can do is, so I'm just going to drag this all the way up and out. So by dragging that, I can also kind of move execution. So if I want to go through this whole process again, I can just drag that cursor back there, and then I can step over and go through it all over again. But yeah, so let's add a breakpoint at the for each. What I can then do is right click on the breakpoint, select conditions. Now conditions, I want a conditional expression, so you can also do other things like a hit count. Hit count, what that means, well, is that it'll only trigger after this line of code has been executed for a certain number of times. and then a certain number of times you would give it the count. So hit count would be, let's say, 5, or whatever the case is that you would want it. After it's executed and that line of code has been hit 5 times, only then would the breakpoint kind of stop execution there for you. But let's do our conditional expression. Our conditional expression is when our player dot name equals Lemmy, right? So I go ahead and press enter. Now if I go ahead and just continue, you can see now it's gone through. So for example, if we look at players, I can hit this view button and it'll show me the full list. We can see that Lemmy is the second one, so it's executed, it's gone through Billy, it's come to Lemmy, and now the condition is true. Only then will the execution stop. Only then will it stop execution on the breakpoint, since our condition of the player name equals Lemmy is true. And then you can kind of inspect, do what you need to do. This is really useful. I only found out about this quite a few years into my sort of career, and when I found out, it was like, wow, why had I not known about this earlier? Because yeah, it's really useful when you're debugging something and maybe you have a list of I don't know, 30, 50, even hundreds of things, and you're trying to debug for one specific case. So maybe you have a list of funds or whatever the case is, but the calculations are all for one of the specific funds. It's an easy way just to narrow it down, say that the fund is whichever fund, the S&P 500, whatever, and then once it hits that one, then you can kind of go through the process, go through the calculations, see what's wrong, and yeah, just narrow it down. I want to try keep it somewhat short, so I think I'll stop it there. Remember, there are many features. Don't try to do all of them all at once. I would say pick one or two that kind of stood out to you and see if you can apply it, see if it works in certain situations for you, and then slowly kind of add another one and another one as you go along. You'll kind of see what's useful and what's not for your specific situations. Try not to get overwhelmed by it or try to do too much too soon. It will evolve as you go. But otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope it was useful. I hope if you're not a developer or you're not a tech person, I hope it was kind of interesting, or yeah, at least easy to somewhat follow along.